HR leaders, what's on your mind these days? Is it AI? Is it the economy? The talent market? Remote work? Retention? DEI? Pay transparency? New laws? Our 2024 Workplace Trends Report outlines how HR leaders are thinking about these challenges and what they believe will help their organizations overcome them. Want to find out what they said? Head on over to peoplemanagingpeople.com/Workplace Trends 2024 and download the report to find out.
Start with yourself. And what I mean by that is examine your own story. What was your best onboarding experience of your life? And what was missing that you would have liked to have experienced and seen? And start to create that as a story.
Welcome to the People Managing People podcast. We're on a mission to help you build a better world of work and to create happy, healthy, and productive workplaces. I'm your host, Tim Reitsma. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you listened to or read a great story? What about the story captivated you? Was it the way the scene was described or the plot twist that took place? When it comes to our employee experiences, specifically onboarding, are we telling great stories? Are we inviting employees and, new employees into a story? In this episode, I sit down with Jerome, Deroy, story expert and CEO of Narativ, a company helping you use the power of storytelling to design and deliver programs that create ownership, empower, and engage employees. Onboarding doesn't have to be a checklist, even though checklists are helpful, or a dull day of reading procedures. It must be more than that. Stay tuned and learn how the power of story will transform your onboarding experience. Jerome, welcome to the People Managing People podcast. This topic of storytelling and storytelling in business is something I am just fascinated with and passionate about. And I appreciate you taking the time today and spending some time with me and with our listeners. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and before we hit record, we always, have a little conversation about yourself and your business, and sometimes I just wish I could just hit record on that because it's so much insight and hate to make you repeat yourself. But why don't you take just a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself and what's top of mind for you these days?
Yeah, well, who I am, first of all, I grew up in France, and my mother's American, so I had two sides. But I grew up in France, spent all my summers in the U.S., and very much from a kind of business background. My father was a business leader with lots of experience, and so I kind of grew up in that environment. And I went to business school myself, and then I started a career in finance, which took me from Paris to Hong Kong by the time I was 25 years old. And the only thing was that, on paper, it's like one of those resumes where you kind of see things going up, up, and up, and it's fantastic. But what was really going on internally is that is not what I wanted to do. So what you would have seen then is someone who's performing at work and who's doing all their work. And looking back, I might have been what we now are calling quiet quitters for a while in the company that I was working for, because for about 5 years, I would say that after year one, I was one of those disengaged employees. And so much so that I ended up quitting that job. And I came to New York to look for work in film. My idea was that I would take all of this business experience, 5 years plus a business school, and deliver that to filmmakers who were having trouble putting their great work out there. And I met a documentary filmmaker in 2003, and he and I had a great conversation, and I became his intern. And then I became his production manager after a couple months, started to see a little bit of money coming in. And then he told me about this company that he had founded a little bit on the side back in the mid 1990s, early 2000s. And it had been created as a response to a public health crisis at the time. This was back in 1994, kind of the peak of this public health crisis, which was the HIV and AIDS crisis, where we didn't have the treatments that exist today. So people were dying. And it was quite a bit of a mystery. And, there were lots of protests and things like that. And he had developed a methodology to help people tell their stories around the virus so that they could kind of be seen as human again and not just labeled as someone who's other. And it was very successful. And in fact, it was one of the most successful social movements of our time. People advocated for better rights, better care, better treatments. And it led to the treatments that exist today. And so on the heels of that success, he had always wondered, is there something else I could be doing with this storytelling thing? And when I appeared in his life with my business background, he said, well, maybe we could do something in business. And that really rang a bell for me or a light bulb went off, I should say, because I was one of those disengaged people. And I thought that with this methodology of storytelling, we could really help engage people at work in a much more effective way. So that's how I came to do what I'm doing today. And what's top of mind is still that idea of engagement at work, because still today, I think, as you well know, more people feel disengaged at work than not. And so really, this is a huge issue, and we see it time and time again. And we see the headlines: great resignations, quiet quitting, all these things. And so that's what we're responding to with this, and that's always top of mind for me.
Well, I think it's so important for anyone who's listening, whether you're a leader, HR professional, manager, individual contributor. It's the power of stories it's powerful. It's important. And if we skip that in our communication, if we just jump to the conclusion, the wrap up of the story, how often do we just fill in the blanks? How often do employees are left feeling like, okay, well, I've been told what to do, but I don't know why we're doing this. And then we start filling in that narrative. We're going to talk specifically about onboarding, but I think what we're going to be talking about today is something that will resonate across all opportunities or all areas of, if you look at business, the employee life cycle. But we're focusing on that onboarding and being able to tell that story. But before we get into that, I always ask a couple questions, and right off the bat, one question is, what does it mean to be a leader? When you hear that word leader, what comes to mind?
What comes to my mind is, that a great leader equals a great listener. And I think that is what's missing a lot these days in leadership. There is, especially in times of change and crisis, there is an impulse to come up with solutions because you're the leader. And it's your role to do that. And you're the face of your organization, your company, your country. And so you got to come up with those solutions and deliver on those solutions. But the problem with that is that, you're going to hit or miss, right? And you haven't really listened to what's actually going on. And I think what's going on in organizations quite a bit is that there isn't enough listening happening that actually tries to hear from all different kinds of voices and then start to make a decision from there, right? There's a great book by Simon Sinek called, Leaders Eat Last. And it's the idea that, you put everyone else in front and you come last, right? And the idea behind that is that you are truly listening to what people have to say. You're observing. It's almost like you're an anthropologist, in your own organization and really seeing what's happening. And you're not talking in that moment. You're just listening. And so I think if leaders start there with listening, it really creates much better results.
We're so aligned on this, Jerome. It's not rehearsed. I didn't know what you were going to say, but literally earlier on today, I had a conversation with somebody who was asking me, what does it mean to be, or what's a skill around new management? And it's that art of listening. It's not coming in and saying, here's my agenda, now you have to follow me. It's that absorption. We need to listen. And I interviewed somebody recently who was also completely aligned. And he also said, sometimes we do need to interject because, we need to listen, but we also need to be at that forefront. But then also listen, continuously listen. If we just sat here with earplugs on and just spoke and didn't listen, that's the visualization I have when you're saying about a good leader, but also what makes not a good leader.
Yeah. And, there's a relationship between those two things, between listening and speaking, right? Listening and telling. And it's a reciprocal relationship. So the more you listen to me, the more I'm encouraged to speak. And the way that I'm speaking is shaping how you're listening to me, and so it's sort of whatever I say. So, the person you were interviewing saying, sometimes you have to interject. That's because someone said something that allows you to interject, right? So you listen to that person and you found a moment where you need to interject. Then that person listens to your interjection And that shapes what you're going to say next. It's this constant loop. And the problem is that, where things break down is that there's many obstacles that get in the way of our ability to listen to other people and to ourselves. And a lot of those obstacles are completely invisible and imperceptible because they happen in our heads, right? And kind of in our bodies as well. And so we feel something, we've got emotions, we've got judgments, we've got interpretations about something, and it prevents us from really listening to the other person, which in turn turns into something that's more like, I'm not actually present, right? My mind is somewhere else. So the more we can tune into what those obstacles are and develop strategies to, not get rid of the obstacles, but set them aside so that you can be more and more present for someone else. That's when the magic happens. That's when suddenly there's something that's going to come out of your mouth, Tim, that you didn't even anticipate, right? Kind of like what just happened, right? We didn't rehearse this, and I said something, and you said, "Oh, wow, we're really aligned on this," right? And I think that's when if we're not aware of these kinds of things that get in the way, and we don't consciously, actively work to sort of set them aside so that we can be present for someone else, then nothing is really going to change in our interactions, right? There isn't going to be that moment of spark or innovation.
Yeah, I think we could go on that whole conversation and take a left turn on this, and I sort of want to, but I think we'll continue down the path of onboarding. But I think just from that sense of leadership, and it does blend into even the onboarding and storytelling, but I think where we're going to and where we will go to is, even right before we hit record, was storytelling is not just about telling a story, it's about listening. And it's about that practice of listening. If I was sitting here on my phone as you're speaking to me and we're looking at each other through our cameras, what is that going to say? But also, if we're telling our managers or training our new managers to say, hey, you need to be ready, you need to have the loudest voice, you need to have an opinion. If you're talking, I'm already then starting to make up answers, and I'm not fully present. So I think there's something that we should be unpacking in there. Maybe that's a lead into the next question. When you hear that phrase, build a better world of work, that's our publication's whole purpose. What comes to mind when you hear that?
Well, an example comes to my mind, an experience, when you talk about building a better world of work, and it's linked totally to what we've been talking about. So you're right, there is a connection there. We worked with a company that was, had gone from startup to then experiencing a high level of growth and, a high pressure environment as well, because you always have to perform against the expectations of your investors. And this company was, very much in the news and had just gone through a restructuring. And the person who was leading that company, we had been doing some trainings with them around storytelling, around their messaging, basically, and how to tell a better story. And she wanted to sort of impart these skills internally as well as externally. And so we were working with some of her employees. And one day, she came to us and she said, I just don't understand, because it seems like when we have meetings, people just aren't really present. They're not really listening. And so we said, well, could we participate in one of those meetings and just observe what's going on? And the first thing we noticed is that everyone had a device, that was open and, and it was completely normal. It was just the standard, multiple things, a tablet, a phone, a laptop, and everybody's kind of looking at that. And then the leader comes in and they sort of are quiet for a moment. And what the leader did is that they took out their devices, right? And she started to respond to a text after her intro. And then she responded to something else. And after the meeting, we told her, well, that's, your issue is actually quite simple. You're modeling something and you're expecting a different outcome, and something that's, you're expecting your employees to act in a different way than you are. And essentially, you're the one who's modeling this behavior of constantly being responsive to something. And now that was granted, that was one of their values, right? They needed to act fast, was one of the values of this organization. And so she felt like that's what she needed to model, is that every time there's something that comes in, you respond to it right away and you act quickly and you get better results that way. But the problem was that there's a time for that to happen. And maybe this wasn't the time. Clearly it wasn't, because no one was really paying attention and no one was really present, and these meetings didn't go anywhere. And so I say that as a way of answering your question around building a better world of work, because to me, that's the epitome of it. It's all about listening, and it's all about being present and connected to the needs of the people around you, whether that's your team or your customers, right? And we tend to put the customer at the very, very top there and say, that's really the only person worth, responding to and listening to. But actually, you have to sort of trickle that down everywhere else. And to me, that's building a better world of work where everyone's voice counts. Even the people that you don't hear much from, the introverts and all of that, make sure that you are actually creating structures where they can speak, where their ideas can come out, and where they're involved and engaged. And that's the responsibility of the leader to that. So, coming back to what makes a good leader.
I love that you've kind of brought that full circle, which is, I love that, being present, listening. Just that story of walking into a meeting room, everyone's got their devices. I've been in those meetings. I'm sure there's a number of people who are listening that can relate to that, which is going like, okay, well, I don't know why I'm at this meeting, so I'm just going to work. And somebody asks a question and you look up because you thought you heard your name, and then you kind of panic a little bit and go, could you repeat that? Because you're not present. You're not listening.
Yeah, and you don't think that it matters in the moment. That's where the problems arise, really, is that you don't think that just because you're quiet and it's not your meeting and you're working on your laptop and from time to time you look at the speaker and you look around and you nod, you think, okay, I'm having my act of presence here. But actually, it's impacting how others are speaking. That's the relationship between listening and speaking, right? If I see that around the room and I'm trying to convey a message, I don't feel full permission to do that. I don't feel full permission to come out and say what I need to say. And I'm even impeded by that, even if I'm not aware of it. And I think, just us creating that awareness for them, then it's a simple, procedural, structural system that you do. You just say, at the top of the meeting, we put our phones and devices away, right? And then after that, we check in with each other. And then we go on with the agenda, right? And at this time, we will be done. And we make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. That's also the responsibility of the leader, in those meetings. So I love talking about meetings because I think it's such a great sort of natural way to bring in some of these principles of communication and experiment with them, right? Because nobody likes meetings. Nobody likes going into meetings. And yet we have them all the time. So why not try to make them as effective as possible so that people can start enjoying them again?
Mm-hmm. And I think it just even in the context of onboarding someone and that employee experience, I just think of this image of somebody who's eager, excited to join your organization, who's coming in, first meeting, maybe they still have their pen and notebook. That's me. I like to take my notes in the old fashioned way. Sits down and looks around, and everyone is buried into their phone or their laptop, and you can see screens that are not relevant to the meeting. That just sets a tone. Is it setting the right tone?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just, I know we're alluding to onboarding, but I have to tell you this story about my own experience of onboarding, which to a certain extent has influenced much of my career up to now. That job that I was talking about in finance, my first week there, actually my first day when I got there, I got to I was 25 years old, fresh out of business school. I came out of the 15th floor, at the 15th floor from the elevator, this huge glass building looking over the Hong Kong harbor, with mainland China in the background. So really exotic for me. I'd never even been to Asia before. And here I was, and I was excited. My heart was beating fast, and I was about to go through those double doors towards my desk, which was this big open desk with floor to ceiling windows overlooking that harbor. And this HR person came over to me, the director of HR, and said, welcome, very warm. And then she said, no, we're not going there. We've got to go the other way. And so I followed her down this hallway, and it was very, there was lots of natural light at the beginning. And the more we were walking, the less of that there was. And it became darker and darker and darker until we got to this little room. And then she pointed me towards a conference room that had room enough for one table and two chairs. And there were two large binders on the table. And she said, well, the first thing you're going to do is go through these binders, the employee handbook and the compliance handbook. And that's what I did for the next 48 hours. I just went home to eat and sleep, and then I came back. And it wasn't, I think it took another week. I watched training videos, on VHS tapes, even though this was 1999, but they still have VHS tapes. And, the old thing kind of like in those television series, and nothing related to my to my job, really, or to what I wanted to do in that organization and the reason that I was excited about it. And that lasted for about a week. And at the end of that week, I finally met people who were relevant to my position. But the result of that week, I've thought about a lot because I ended up quitting that job 4 or 5 years later. But it's that first week that set that tone that you were talking about earlier. It's when you walk into that room, it's when you welcome someone. It's what do you do with that person that first hour, those first 2 hours, that first week, that first month, whatever your structure is for onboarding people. Really look at that because it has a huge impact on people. And if it had been different for me, I guarantee that it would have had a different outcome even 4 or 5 years later, because I see this all the time now.
Well, and you remember that. And I think of it as it's that first experience. So let's say, Jerome, you hired me and I was coming in, maybe even virtually, into your workplace for the first time. And if it was, hey, Tim, just read these documents for the next 3 days and then we'll talk. I think I might go to LinkedIn and try to find another job and go, I think I made the wrong decision. But if it was an experience of, hey, Tim, you're in Vancouver, Canada, you're in New York, I'm in New York, we're a world away, but we're going to spend the next 3 days just getting to know each other. We're going to talk about the business, talk about our work. We're going to get you working on a few things. We're going to set you up for success. I'm going to be excited. And it's that first impression, that first experience that means so much. And how does this relate then to story and storytelling? How do we bring in story into that onboarding experience? Because I just love the VHS story. I can picture you sitting in this room, door closes, you got these two big binders, you're looking around going, okay, well, what did I get myself into? How does story fit into this?
Well, the story is really critical because, that first impression you're talking about, that first experience, if I get to hear stories about what my job is like, what the culture of this company is like, and I hear them from the people that actually are involved with or were involved with my job, perhaps, and live the values of this company that I just stepped into, then I start to get a more embodied experience of the culture of this organization that I'm stepping into, of this job that I'm now taking on and that I'm excited about. Because that's the other thing about onboarding. You get people that are excited. It's probably the most excited you will be about a job until you get promoted and do something, but as long as there's that sort of structural way of keeping people excited. But that first day, you're ready and you're open, right? And so that's really critical to start for the leaders of that organization to really gather these stories and to tell them strategically to the people that they're onboarding. Because then what you're doing, you're not doing that just to sort of tell a story that's engaging for someone else, but it's also about activating that what I call the kind of storytelling muscle in someone else's brain. So in this case, the person who's getting onboarded, you're inviting them to tell their story. Once you've told all those stories and they've heard them, it's really important to build into that onboarding process a time when that person gets to tell their story based on what they heard, right? So if I tell you a story about one of the values of my organization, one of the values of our organization at Narativ is listening, right? As you can imagine, I've already told you quite a bit about it, but I could tell you that story about the leader, who wasn't quite present and modeling some behavior. And then I could ask you, what does listening mean to you as a value? When was a time in your life that you experienced true listening, either on your part or on the part of somebody else? So you're inviting them now to tell a story that's linked to the values of your organization. So they now feel a sense of belonging. They feel like they have a voice in this organization from the very first day because you care about it. And it's not like we said, our values are fixed. These are all the stories that we have about our values. Now go off and learn that, right? It's about what are your stories? Where is your voice within this structure? We want to hear about that. We're interested in that. And so you're setting that tone once again around, what is permissible and what can I do in this organization? And then there's also a bunch of other things that, you're doing strategically. People learn much better, and this is proven scientifically, with stories than they do with data. We remember stories more than data and statistics. And so when you're talking to people about a new job, it's really important to try to gather those stories of people who've been in their shoes before, so that they can start to hear stories about what their job truly is like. Not a job description, not the bullet points that you responded to in your application, but a real human being that went through this. And don't ask those human beings to tell stories about the bullet points. Tell them about the things that are not in the job description, right? The time when a real challenge occurred and it was not expected, and you didn't know that this was something that your job entailed, because you're also now giving people permission to think a little bit outside of that box of the job description. It's like, oh, well, if my predecessor or someone who was in my shoes, responded in this way to a situation that wasn't scripted, that wasn't something that happened in the past, then that gives me a sense that maybe I can be like that way too. I can bring something of who I am to this role that's a little different, that's not kind of the beaten path. So there's multiple ways to use storytelling, but I think using it right at the beginning is really important. And then you don't sit back, you lean in and you listen to the stories that the people that are being onboarded have to tell, because it'll be a circle. At the end, when, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, somebody else gets onboarded, it's the story of that person that was onboarded 2 years ago that you're going to use for them. And that again creates a new sense of belonging and incentivizes people. It's like, oh, I'm going to be the one telling stories in a couple of years, right?
Yeah, I want to play devil's advocate just a little bit in this. And because often I have heard internally in organizations or friends who are in charge of the onboarding experiences, we just don't have time. We've got a checklist of things. We got to make sure their emails are set up, their passwords are set up. We have to introduce them to all these, these 4, 5, or 6, 7 people. We've got a very packed schedule. We've got a presentation to highlight the most important things in our employee manual, our policies, and then intro to their leader and intro with the CEO, and away they go. And so often that's what I've heard. And I've actually been part of that, where we're onboarding, we're hiring people. At one point we're onboarding, 3 or 4 people a day for a month straight. So creating that narrative, it's hard. So where would we go from there? What would you be telling people?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's totally a valid point, because we get that all the time too. And, it's one of those, in the sales process for us, it's one of those objections, that you have to be able to respond to. And it's really valid. I totally get it, because it does take, an investment of time and money. The thing that's really important to remember, though, is that we now have access to a variety of different platforms to deliver our messages. And we sort of view onboarding for some reason as a little bit separate from all that. So if you think about, I can watch my favorite television series whenever I want. I don't have to wait for a certain time, et cetera. Well, it's the same thing in organizations. We have access to all these apps that help us do a better job more quickly, and it's all more automated. You can do that with onboarding too. And what I mean by that is that you have to sort of look at, what is the culture in your organization? If it is fast-paced and you don't have a lot of time for things, what's the best medium to tell these stories in? So I'll give you an example. We worked with an organization where, it was decided pretty early on that people wanted something more of an on-demand experience, even at the onboarding stage. So that what we did is that we interviewed a couple of people, not many, we interviewed just 2 stakeholders for specific jobs, and who, we decided to start with the values and the culture of the organization, and then go into some of the more job related, specifics. And then we interviewed those people, and we created a podcast that was internal to the organization. It's not something you could look at, that wasn't open to the public, but it was specifically for all the people that were being onboarded. And, we had a host and we had someone who was interviewing, much like what you're doing here with me, except that we built that into a learning management system, so that you would go through as a person onboarded, and it would just take you an hour to do so. You would listen to these 4 episodes, and each episode had a story and a value that was attached to it. And then you had a quiz and you had some assignments, all in your own time. So people could listen to this at the gym. They could listen to this wherever. They had to listen, however, in their first 3 weeks of that job, right? And again, because you're being onboarded and it's a new job, you're excited, you want to do it. And so on the part of the people who are organizing this, didn't take a lot of time. We just ask them to go into a booth and work with us for a couple hours to be interviewed and tell stories. And then we put it all into their learning management system that was already existent, something that they already had. So it doesn't, I want to sort of dispel this myth that, it's kind of adding a whole bunch of work when actually it's not really, because you have to, yes, there is a little bit of time to put in, but as long as you can be really specific about what you're looking for and not too broad, and make sure that you're including all the compliance stuff that you have to include, then great. But don't start with the compliance stuff, by God. Please, God, don't start with the compliance stuff. I know it's got to be in there, and we work it in there even, try to make it a little more playful and entertaining, and try to make it more story-based if possible. But, you can really start there. And a lot of times, it's starting with the founder. It's starting with the leader of that organization. What's their story? Very, very often, organizations will have that already baked in. So start with what you've got. If you've got that, then break it down. Maybe it's the founder that you interview first. Maybe that's the first story you got to hear. And then you hear from a couple different employees, and, you're pretty much set for the beginning at least.
Again, we're so aligned on this. I think what's coming to mind is if we skip that in the onboarding process, in that employee experience, and just jump into here's what you need to do, here's what you shouldn't do, here's your laptop, go get to work. How's that setting up somebody for success? I think you're setting up basically just a robot job. And it might offend some people who are listening. I don't know. But take the time. We basically, when we break it down like this, we're hiring somebody. They've accepted an offer. They're leaving something else. They're leaving a job, whether they like it or not, or love it or hate it. But you're inviting somebody to join your organization. They're coming into the organization. Do you want this person, to sit at the dinner table on the phone with friends or family, or sitting down with their family? And what do you want them to say? Do you want them to say, man, I made the best decision? Or do you want that person to say, I made a horrible decision? Uh-oh. And you, as somebody who's responsible for onboarding, whether you're the founder or HR or manager, you have that ability to either say, to have somebody have that experience of, I made the right decision or I made the wrong decision. That's a big responsibility. That's a huge responsibility.
Yeah, it is a big responsibility. And I think you're absolutely right. And it pays dividends later. That's the thing, is that you really have to become conscious of that, I think. And the way to sort of advocate for better onboarding is to come from that place that, in the long run, not even that long, this is going to pay off, right? Especially in the face of all the choices that people have. I have had clients, come to us telling us, look, we have a problem with our onboarding, clearly, because we've hired a couple people and they left during the onboarding process because they decided that, this wasn't for them based on how they were being onboarded. So clearly we need to change something, and it's so costly to, have to fire someone or have someone resign, having to replace them. It costs so much more money to do that than to create a robust onboarding process that may last a little longer than your typical, 1 week and you're done, like you were describing earlier. Meet the couple of people that are important, have your laptop and go to work. This may mean that your onboarding process should last a little bit longer. But again, it's, maybe it'll be more costly at the outset, but it's really worth its weight in gold, because then you've got people that are engaged, that want to stay, and that want to be part of that next iteration of what the onboarding looks like. By the end of, we've had clients that work with these, for more than 5 years for these systems that we create for them. And every year or 2 years, we update the stories. And it's so great to go back and, talk to the people that were onboarded a year or two before, and now they're part of that learning management system I was talking about earlier, right? And now it's their story that's featuring prominently in these new people, in the stories of the people that are being onboarded now. That's part of their process. So it's exciting to be able to be part of that, I think. And the more you can excite people around that idea that, you're going to be part of something, that's what retains people at the end of the day.
It invites people into that story. And I've coached and advised a number of individuals and a number of companies on just that. Is people have come to me and said, Tim, like, my people just aren't passionate. about what they're doing. Like, well, do they know how their work is helping your organization work towards achieving their vision? I mean, if people don't know what they're doing and how it's affecting the organization and how it will help grow that organization, how it will impact society or whatever you're doing, then how can you create a place that people are excited about? I love that simple, that internal podcast. I love that. It doesn't have to be the CEO showing up, every day to an onboarding session. I think, there's still something to be said about having that personal interaction with the leader. I'm a huge advocate for it, but you can schedule that depending on how quickly you're onboarding, because people want to hear from the senior leaders and want to hear what gets them excited about the organization, and invite people in, and then invite people to share. Hey, welcome to, company XYZ. Thanks for choosing us. What brought you here? What made you want to apply for this job?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it's essentially a collection. What starts to emerge is a collection of founder stories, even though you're not the founder of the organization as the new person being onboarded. But that's what a founder story is. It's an origin story. It's, how did you come up with this? And, what brought you here? And it's the same with every single employee, because as human beings, that's what we crave. I'm always, when I'm at the dinner table with somebody new, I'm always like, or if it's like a couple, it's like, how did you meet? We're interested in the origins of things. We want to know where you started. And I think, that's available to every single person on earth, no matter what your job is. There is a place where you started, and that brought you to exactly where you are. And you may or may not be conscious of how that happened, but when someone asks you the question, suddenly this whole world opens up to you, and you're like, oh yeah, right. These were all my steps. This was my journey, right? I didn't just I'm not a series of bullet points on a resume, and this really helps to kind of humanize that process.
I think you just brought it back full circle for me. And whether it's the onboarding experience or whether it's leadership or build a better world of work, it's asking good questions, being present, listening. If it's, if we were onboarding, or if I was onboarding you, or you're onboarding me, we're, half a country away, we can still do this without distractions. Snooze your notifications. Let somebody know, hey, I paused everything. I do have maybe you've got a call in 10 minutes that you're waiting for, own it, talk about it, but be present. Lean in, ask questions. How did you come about being here? What's your story? What's your journey? These are our values. Tell me about your values. What do you value? And be attentive, because guess what? I bet at that dinner table, if that was somebody's first experience, maybe they didn't even get into their job, but that's their first experience. I bet somebody's going to be sitting there going, I made the right decision.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you've summed it up really well. That's basically it. It's taking something. I think, sometimes we sort of feel like work and life are so separate, and we create all these structures to separate them even more. And I'm advocating for, and it sounds like you are too, and I think that's how we build a better world of work, is by actually doing a little bit less of that, and taking what works in everyday life, those human interactions that we have, what facilitates those human interactions, and let's use that at work in our communications with people, especially at the onboarding level, so that people who are just starting feel welcomed, they feel invited in, they feel like their story matters.
Yeah, their story matters. I think that's a good way to sum up our conversation. And I always like to end with one thing, which is, somebody's listening today. Maybe they're driving to the office, driving to work. Maybe they're on lunch, wherever you're listening, wherever somebody's listening. They're thinking about onboarding, or they're thinking about story. What is one thing somebody can do today to maybe improve that onboarding experience? And aside from saying, well, it's HR's responsibility, so we'll just leave it to them. But how can I, as a manager or leader, really own that onboarding experience? What can we do to improve?
It's a great question. And I think, I like to tell people that it starts with you, because we often get bogged down by, oh, I got to go and ask a consultant, or I got to go ask my job, or I got to go talk to HR about this. Start with yourself. And what I mean by that is examine your own story. What was your best onboarding experience of your life? And what was missing that you would have liked to have experienced and seen, and start to create that as a story. Kind of like, when I told my story of what it was like to enter that company and I was so excited, and then I went into a corridor that got darker and darker and darker. That was my, kind of bad onboarding experience, but it influenced me and it had an impact. What were those experiences that impacted you when you were being onboarded, negatively or positively? Start there. And I think that'll give you an indication of what it is that you would like to create. Start there. And the only other piece of advice that I would say is when you're examining your own story, really look at the details of what happened as opposed to what you thought about what happened or what you felt about what happened or what your judgments were about what happened. So in other words, try to make it as concrete as possible. Like the story I told, I was in a room that had 2 chairs and 1 table, and there were no windows, less and less sunlight. I watched training videos. Those details give you a lot of information. I could have just told you I had a terrible onboarding experience. I really didn't like it. And 4 years later, I quit my job. That's not a story, right? That doesn't tell you anything about me, my experience, and what was unique about it. So I really encourage people who are listening, when you do examine your story, try to apply just that principle of saying what happened as opposed to your thoughts and feelings about what happened. Try to edit those out and just say what happened. Use the 5 senses to do that, because that's helpful too.
I think that's some great advice. What happened? Just separating yourself from your thoughts, your feelings. What are the concrete things, the details, as I wrote down in my notes, that happened? Well, Jerome, I'm so grateful for you, and thank you for reaching out. And I'm so glad that we were able to get you on the podcast. I think this will help. It helps me, and I know it'll help our listeners, not just maybe in their onboarding experience, but thinking about story and how story should be just such a big component of our lives and how we lead and how we interweave this into the onboard experience. So for those who are interested to learn more about you, what would be the best way to track you down?
Oh, great. Well, yeah, there's a couple of things. One is our website, and that's www.narativ.com. It's spelled with 1 R and no E. And that's our website. And there's a bunch of different resources. I think people can go to our blog, and we have, lots of articles about what's timely right now that leadership in particular is thinking about. And then 2 other things. One is that we have a book that's out that's called Powered by Storytelling. And each chapter is a step of our methodology. There's one chapter that's about this idea of saying what happened, as opposed to your thoughts and feelings about what happened. And many others, there's one about listening and obstacles to listening. So you really get a sense of what this method is, and you can kind of create your own story by reading this book. And then the third thing is that we have a podcast called Story Talks, Narativ Story Talks, Narativ spelled the way our company is. And that's available on any podcast, wherever you find your podcasts. So Narativ Story Talks, and it's hosted by me and my colleague Julianne Ryan, who's a specialist in HR questions, such as the one we've been talking about today.
Well, that's perfect. And we'll make sure to include that in the show notes as well. So thanks again for coming on. And for those who are listening, I'm always interested in your feedback or your thoughts. Please send me an email to tim@peoplemanagingpeople.com or find me on LinkedIn. And as always, if you like this episode, please like and subscribe to the show. And again, Jerome, thanks for coming on. And for those who are kind of getting their day started or wrapping up their day, thanks for spending some time with us.
You're so welcome. Thank you.